Support for this program provided by
Hello fellow wood shopperoos, Chad here, and as you can see behind me I'm starting to get things set up in my new shop. But that's not what this video is about. This video is a continuation from last week, which featured my good friend Dennis Laney. Now last week I gave you a little introduction to Dennis and who he is, some of the things that he's built and what he's accomplished, and this video series is focusing on his latest workbench. Now, Dennis has 3 workbenches in his shop. Each one is uniquely different. Now, the first one he's going to show you today is one that he's used for many, many years. He's going to talk about the ergonomics to it. He's going to talk about the placement of it. He's going to talk about a unique vise that he has on it. But most important, he's going to talk about the construction on this one. And it was a construction method that was very popular. You see it out there quite a bit. But he's going to tell you the major flaw behind it and why it kind of falls short for him, leading up to his ultimate workbench. But let's see where he's at right now with this first one.
This workbench came about, I had been using a German cabinet maker's bench, the old standard style that's been used for a couple of hundred years at least. My youngest son had moved to Columbus, and I wanted to give him my old workbench, so I decided to build a new one for myself. There's several things that drove this. First off, I had a huge slab of walnut. This top is a single slab. And I wanted to build something that was just kind of prettified, for the lack of a better word. So I went a little bit over the top on this. The other thing, too, is I had an Emmert's replica pattern maker's bench, or pattern maker's vise, that we can get into in a couple of minutes. I'll give you the idea of one of the benefits, or number of benefits about that vise. But the platform itself is ash. Stretchers are ash. And I put it together with dovetailed tenons, with tusk tenons. And I got to say that over the years, you know, that particular style of connection seems to be very, very popular, seems to be still very much in vogue. But I'll tell you, if you use your workbench a lot, you do get a lot of movement. If you're in an unheated area or an area that has different varying humidities and temperatures, your workbench moves. After all, it is wood, so it's subject to the forces of work that you put onto it and seasonal movement. And those tenons will work loose. These particular tenons are, if I remember right, either 8 or 10 degrees. So they should be a locking tenon or a locking wedge. But even that said, they still work loose. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but I've gone to a more modern style of fastening. In any event, the first consideration that I make when I build a workbench is the height. And I really just like to back up to the bench and have the cheeks of my butt just touch right on that workbench. The reason being is because I still have a tendency to sit up on the bench and do a lot of work. When I cut mortises, many times I'll cut mortises, I'll just sit myself down on it and cut the mortise in line. So you don't want the bench too high. The other thing is, when you're planing, you want to use your body. You want to be able to rock back and forth. And if you're up too high, you're using your arms. And I know there's a couple of English cabinet makers now that are recommending a much higher bench. But I still do the bulk of my work with hand tools. So I'm pretty, I want to be in a situation where I can use my body weight to an advantage. And if you get your workbench too high, it's all arms. So it becomes very difficult, and tool control becomes very difficult as well. This bench has got an Emmert's replica pattern maker's vise. And a lot of people aren't familiar with a pattern maker's vise, but it was used by people who were making wooden patterns for the foundry industry. You don't find them anymore other than replicas and antiques, but they're a very useful work holding device. A pattern maker's vise is capable, of course, of any of the standard vise type movements, but the jaws pivot, and you can hold tapers in the jaws as they are. They also will spin, and so they can spin all the way over, and you'll see that most pattern makers' vices have what we call a filing jaw, set of filing jaws on the bottom, which proved to be pretty helpful at times. They're also set up with dogs in the vices, so you can hold things, that are irregular between those 4 points. There's a set of curved jaws on the bottom dogs and square jaws on the top dogs. The other beauty of this vise is, if I can find the handle, is that it can pivot. And this is very useful if you're for any number of things, especially if you're carving, and if you want to reposition something so you can get a more controlled angle with your work. Let me just put this back down. The vise at the end is just a standard vise mechanism that's available right now, and it's got a couple of ways to keep it from racking back and forth. Now that said, there still is a little bit of racking to it, but it's a very large, very useful vise. Now, you don't use a tail vise very often, and one of the mistakes I made with this vise, quite frankly, is because of my dog hole set up on the top, it doesn't really allow me to do a lot of holding of a workpiece out toward the edge. So that was clearly a negative on this particular piece. Again, though, the idea of this was to be pretty. So you'll notice the drawer has crotch walnut veneer and an edge trimming of quarter sawn oak, which is, again, a little bit over the top. But it's just a typical, very heavy utilitarian drawer that you'd find mounted under most vices. The other thing that you probably won't see on a lot of vices is this is just a little reminder to myself that I shouldn't stand around thinking too much, or just I should work. So this, of course, is tempus fugit memento mori. And the older I get, the more meaning that has. The other thing is the dog holes are drilled on a little different pattern than you'll see on most benches, and it kind of corresponds with the dogs on the Emmert's pattern vise, in that I can hold pieces in 9 different positions here on this end of the top, and this would be the end that I normally work off of. If I'm going to cut mortises, I'm going to be over this leg, and I can stand at this end when I don't have a bunch of cans in the way. And now that in itself is somewhat limiting, and that kind of started driving me to consider other types of work setups. But that said, it's a beautiful workbench. The height is right. It's very durable. It's finished with shellac, which I've finished all my benches with, because shellac is easy to repair. It's a durable finish, and it looks good when all is said and done. A lot of people have asked me, is it too slippery? Well, my position is that a glossy finish, a glossy film finish, is every bit as sticky because of the friction that it creates. The other problem that I have had, originally I had this vise set up that I could walk all the way around it. Right now, as you can see, it's up against the wall, and when you put a bench up against the wall, you limit its use dramatically. But all in all, it's still a very good workbench. It's still very durable, and if somebody came along and offered me a couple of $1,000 for it, I'd probably sell it.
Now you have a different bench over here, and you're going to explain to our viewers what's different about this other one versus that.
Yeah, and by the way, this is clearly a shop bench. This is not a bench that you would want to move around. It probably weighs about 300 pounds.
Okay, so let's take a look at this other one here.
Okay.
So that was Dennis's first workbench. Now the next one that he's going to show us, it's a bench that you've seen Roy Underhill build in the past. Dennis did his version of it. And again, he likes it, but it falls short in some ways for him. And he'll explain the features to it and the disadvantages. This is all leading up to his latest workbench, what he feels is the ultimate workbench that covers everything for him. So stay tuned. We'll show you that and more next week. And of course, as always, keep on dancing.